Welcome back to Old State Valuable Coins. In today's video, we're exploring 4 of the most valuable and fascinating George Washington quarter dollars, including and uncovering the history, rarity, condition, and surprising values that can make certain old quarters worth far more than their face value. So stay with us, because one small quarter in your collection could have a story and a value you never expected. Let's get started. First up, imagine holding a 1966 Washington quarter in your hand and noticing something that, on many other American coins, would immediately seem unusual. There is no mint mark beneath George Washington's portrait. But before calling this coin rare, we need to understand the extraordinary circumstances in which it was created. The 1966 Washington quarter was born during a major transformation in American coinage, when the United States was struggling with a shortage of circulating coins and rapidly rising demand for silver. For decades, the quarter had been made from silver, but by the early 1960s the metal itself was becoming increasingly valuable. Americans were saving silver coins rather than spending them, collectors were removing them from circulation, and the government faced the difficult task of supplying enough change for a rapidly expanding consumer economy. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Coinage Act of 1965, a landmark piece of legislation that authorized the replacement of silver in the quarter with copper-nickel-clad coinage. The new quarter retained the familiar Washington design, but represented a completely different monetary system. The regular 1966 Washington quarter had a reported mintage of 821,101,500 pieces, making the date common rather than inherently rare. Yet the circumstances surrounding its production make it one of the most historically fascinating quarters of the 1960s. This was also an America experiencing extraordinary political and social change. Johnson's Great Society programs were expanding federal involvement in healthcare, education, poverty reduction, and other areas, while the civil rights movement had produced landmark legislation only a year earlier. At the same time, American military involvement in Vietnam was escalating, creating growing anxiety and division throughout the country. Inflationary pressures were beginning to build beneath an economy that was still expanding strongly, and the government was attempting to manage the costs of both ambitious domestic programs and an increasingly expensive overseas conflict. In the middle of all this, the quarter remained a basic tool of everyday life. It paid for parking, vending machines, transportation, laundry, small purchases, and countless other transactions. The coin may have looked ordinary, but it was participating in a historic transition. America's familiar silver quarter was disappearing, and the modern clad quarter was taking its place. The missing mint mark on a 1966 quarter becomes much more understandable when we examine the government's unusual response to the coin shortage. During the years 1965 through 1967, mint marks were deliberately removed from circulating United States coins. The purpose was to discourage people from separating coins by mint facility, and more importantly, to reduce incentives for collecting and hoarding newly issued coins at a time when the government desperately needed them to remain in commerce. Consequently, a normal 1966 Washington quarter without a mint mark is not automatically an error, and is not rare simply because the letter is absent. This is one of the most important facts a collector should understand before assigning a dramatic value to the coin. The regular 1966 issue is associated with Philadelphia, while special 1966 collector coins were also produced without mint marks, creating another reason to identify the exact type before evaluating it. The regular circulation strike was manufactured in enormous numbers and was intended to disappear into everyday commerce. Millions of Americans handled these coins without ever thinking about their future collectible value. A quarter might leave the mint, travel to a bank, enter a cash register, move into a customer's pocket, and then pass through dozens or hundreds of hands before eventually ending up in a drawer or jar. That journey explains why condition is so important today. A coin designed to circulate naturally accumulated contact marks, scratches, abrasions, dullness, and wear. Some were cleaned by people who believed they were improving their appearance, while others were damaged by storage conditions. A smaller number were saved early and survived with much stronger original surfaces. This is where the concept of rarity changes dramatically. The 1966 date is abundant, but the finest survivors are much scarcer. There is no reliable worldwide census telling us exactly how many 1966 quarters exist today because millions of surviving pieces have never been professionally examined or certified. Grading Service population reports only represent coins submitted for certification and cannot be treated as a complete survival estimate. Therefore, it is more accurate to say that a substantial number of 1,966 quarters undoubtedly survive, while truly exceptional high-grade examples form a much smaller population. The coin's value depends heavily on that distinction. An ordinary worn quarter is a common survivor. A virtually flawless, expertly certified example is a very different object in the eyes of collectors. The most fascinating thing about the 1966 Washington quarter is that its importance exists on two levels at once. It is both a piece of American history and, in exceptional condition, a serious collectible. This small coin was created when the United States was trying to solve a national circulation crisis, replace silver with a practical modern composition, and keep enough change moving through an economy that was expanding rapidly. It entered circulation during Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, when the Great Society was reshaping domestic policy, civil rights legislation was transforming the nation, the Vietnam conflict was intensifying, and inflationary pressures were beginning to complicate the economic picture. Ordinary Americans used the quarter for the simplest activities of daily life, probably never imagining that decades later collectors would study the same coins under magnification and compare their surfaces grade by grade. More than 821 million regular strike examples were originally produced, so it is impossible to honestly claim that the normal 1966 no-mint mark quarter is an ultra-rare coin simply because it lacks a letter. What can become rare is the exceptional survivor. The piece with unusually strong preservation, superior strike quality, original surfaces, or an authenticated variety or error. There is no trustworthy exact number for how many remain today, but the enormous original production figure means that many undoubtedly survive, especially in circulated grades. The truly scarce population is concentrated among the finest preserved examples. If your coin is scratched, heavily worn, cleaned, or damaged, its value will normally remain modest. If it is attractive and uncirculated, the value can rise into the tens or hundreds of dollars depending on its certified grade. If it reaches the highest levels of preservation, the market can become dramatically stronger, with the documented $21,000 MS-68 Plus auction result demonstrating what an extraordinary survivor can achieve. So when you hold a 1966 Washington quarter, do not look only for a missing mint mark and immediately assume you have discovered a fortune. Instead, look at the entire coin and consider its story. Study Washington's portrait, the lettering, the fields, the eagle on the reverse, the rims, the edge, and especially the surfaces. Avoid cleaning it, because original preservation can be far more valuable than artificial brightness. Remember that this quarter was never intended to become a treasure. It was created to solve a practical national problem and keep everyday commerce functioning. Yet one of the remarkable ironies of collecting is that the coins designed to be spent can sometimes become valuable precisely because a few survived far better than anyone expected. The 1966 Washington quarter therefore represents something much bigger than 25 cents. It is a surviving fragment of an America undergoing economic modernization, political conflict, social transformation, and a complete change in the metal composition of its everyday money. Next up to in the Imagine holding a quarter that was born in Denver during one of the most complicated chapters of modern American history, a coin carrying the portrait of George Washington that could have passed through countless hands before eventually finding its way into a collection. This is the 1977 D Washington quarter dollar, identified by the small D mint mark on the reverse. And although more than 256 million were struck, the most exceptional survivors can tell a fascinating story about American money, manufacturing, and everyday life in the late 1970s. The Denver Mint produced exactly 256,524,978 examples of this issue, making it a common date overall rather than an inherently rare coin. PCGS estimates that roughly 89.8 million examples survive in all grades, about 26.9 million survive in grades of MS-60 or better, and approximately 2.69 million survive at MS-65 or better. That means the real mystery is not why every 1977 D quarter is rare, because it is not, but why a small fraction of these enormous production numbers became genuinely scarce at the highest levels of preservation. To understand that, we have to travel back to 1977, when Jimmy Carter had just entered the White House after the turbulent political years surrounding Watergate and the resignation of Richard Nixon. America was attempting to restore confidence in government while simultaneously facing serious economic challenges. Inflation was reducing the purchasing power of ordinary families, unemployment remained a major concern, and the country was still dealing with the consequences of the energy crisis that had shaken American society earlier in the decade. Gasoline prices, energy conservation, government spending, taxes, employment, and monetary policy were all part of national debate. The Federal Reserve was confronting the difficult problem of balancing economic growth and employment against persistent inflation, and in November 1977 Congress passed the Federal Reserve Reform Act, formally strengthening the framework surrounding the Federal Reserve's economic objectives. Against this background, the quarter was not simply a coin sitting inside someone's pocket. It was part of the machinery through which millions of everyday transactions took place. A quarter could buy something from a vending machine, help pay for a small purchase, enter a parking meter, or simply wait inside a cash register for the next customer. The coin had been designed decades earlier to honor George Washington, whose portrait had appeared on the quarter since 1932, and by 1977 that portrait had become one of the most familiar symbols in American circulation. The designer, John Flanagan, had created the Washington portrait that continued to appear on the series, while the reverse featured the American eagle. The coin was also a product of America's post-silver monetary era. Regular Washington quarters had moved to copper-nickel-clad composition beginning in 1965, and the 1977 D continued that system, consisting of copper-nickel outer layers bonded to a copper center. PCGS lists the coin at 24.30 millimeters in diameter and 5.67 grams in weight, with a reeded edge. So when you look at this quarter, you are looking at a piece of a monetary system that had already undergone a major transformation. It was not intended to be a precious metal treasure. It was engineered to be durable, economical, and plentiful enough to serve an enormous national economy. The story becomes even more fascinating when we examine what was happening to Washington quarters across the country during the late 1970s. America was experiencing strong demand for circulating coinage, and production was not limited to a single facility. The familiar no-mint mark Washington quarters of the period were associated with Philadelphia production, but historical research has shown that the West Point Mint also supplied additional circulating quarters without a mint mark during the late 1970s. PCGS notes that West Point struck hundreds of millions of circulating coins without a W mint mark, and that its supplemental quarter production helped meet demand during the late 1970s. For 1977, the combined no-mint mark quarter production included a substantial West Point contribution, while Denver separately struck the 256,524,978 quarters represented by the 1977 D issue. This is important because it reveals how complicated the American coin production system could become when the demand for everyday money increased. The quarter had become a workhorse of the American economy, and the mint had to keep enormous quantities moving into circulation. Inside a minting facility, the process was highly industrial. Metal was prepared into sheets, blanks were punched from those sheets, and the blanks were processed into planchets suitable for striking. The planchet had to meet precise specifications before it could enter a coining press. Hardened dies carried the obverse and reverse designs, and enormous mechanical pressure forced the metal to flow into the recessed design elements. A collar surrounded the planchet during striking and helped control the coin's final dimensions and shape. So, when you place a 1977 D Washington quarter under the light today, you are looking at an object that has survived an enormous amount of time and change. More than 256 million were struck at Denver, and PCGS estimates that approximately 89.8 million examples survive across all grades, which means the ordinary coin is not scarce in the overall population. But rarity is not always about how many were originally made. Sometimes it is about how many survived in exceptional condition. PCGS estimates about 2.69 million surviving at MS65 or better, and the population becomes dramatically more selective at MS66 and MS67. That is why the best examples deserve attention. A A circulated coin might be worth roughly its face value to a collector, while a nicer circulated example can bring a small premium. An about uncirculated piece may be worth more because it retains considerable original detail. Lower mint state coins can bring several dollars, while stronger MS-65 and MS-66 examples can enter the range of tens or even hundreds depending on the exact grade and market. At MS-67, the coin becomes much more difficult, and documented sales have reached hundreds of dollars, while published price guides can place the very highest certified examples around or above the $1,000 level. But the most important thing is not to confuse a guide price with a guaranteed value. The market decides what a specific coin actually brings. A spectacular coin with great eye appeal can outperform expectations, while an unattractive example with the same numerical grade may struggle to achieve the strongest price. Certification also matters because a professional grading service provides an independent assessment that can make a high-grade claim much more credible to buyers. If you believe your coin might be one of the exceptional survivors, do not clean it, do not scratch it, do not attempt to improve its appearance, and do not rely on sensational online advertisements. Preserve the coin exactly as it is and compare it with authenticated high-grade examples. And if you find a dramatic mint error, remember that authentication becomes even more important. The story of the 1977 D. Washington quarter is ultimately a story of probability. The mint created hundreds of millions, expecting them to circulate and wear out. Time then eliminated many from practical collecting consideration through damage, loss, and ordinary use. A much smaller group survived with enough quality to become desirable, and an even smaller group may possess extraordinary grades or legitimate production errors. That is how an apparently ordinary quarter can become fascinating. The coin was never promised to become a treasure. It became interesting because of what happened after it left the mint. It traveled through the economy of 1977, through an America dealing with inflation, energy uncertainty, political change, and cultural transformation, and then somehow survived long enough to reach the hands of a collector decades later. When you turn it over and see that small d, you are not simply looking at a mint mark. You are looking at a connection to the Denver Mint, to the industrial process that created America's circulating money, and to the everyday lives of the people who used it. The 1977 D. Washington quarter may be common in ordinary grades, but the finest survivors tell a much rarer story, and that is what makes this seemingly simple 25-cent coin worth a closer look. Next up when you hold a 1984 Washington quarter with the P mint mark in your hand, you are holding a small piece of an America that was moving rapidly toward the modern age. At first glance, it may appear to be nothing more than an ordinary 25-cent coin, but this little piece of copper and nickel was produced during a remarkable moment in the nation's history. In 1984, the United States was experiencing a powerful mixture of economic recovery, technological change, political confidence, and cultural transformation. Ronald Reagan was serving as president, and the country was emerging from the severe recession that had affected the early years of the decade. Inflation had fallen dramatically from the painful levels of the late 1970s and early 1980s, although interest rates and the memory of that economic turmoil were still fresh in the minds of ordinary Americans. Businesses were expanding, consumers were spending again, and unemployment was falling. At the same time, the personal computer revolution was beginning to change offices, schools, businesses, and eventually homes. The 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles became a major national event, attracting worldwide attention and reinforcing a feeling of optimism and American confidence. Against this backdrop, the Philadelphia Mint was producing enormous quantities of everyday coinage, including the Washington quarter. The purpose was not to create a future treasure. The purpose was practical. Americans needed dependable coins for ordinary transactions. Quarters moved through supermarkets, restaurants, gas stations, vending machines, parking meters, laundromats, public transportation, and countless other parts of daily life. Yet history has a habit of turning ordinary objects into extraordinary artifacts, and the 1984 P quarter is a perfect example of how a coin made for everyday spending can become fascinating decades later. The story of this quarter actually begins long before 1984, with George Washington and the creation of the Washington Quarter series. The quarter was introduced in 1932 as a celebration of the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth. The design was created by sculptor John Flanagan, whose artistic interpretation of Washington became one of the most recognizable portraits ever placed on American money. The coin was intended to honor Washington, the Revolutionary War commander who became the nation's first president and a central figure in the creation of the American Republic. Flanagan's portrait presented Washington facing left, with a restrained and dignified expression rather than an exaggerated heroic pose. That image remained on the quarter for decades, becoming familiar to generations of Americans. By 1984, the design had become deeply embedded in American life. Children learned to recognize Washington's face from the coins in their parents' pockets, while adults used quarters without giving much thought to the historical figure represented on the obverse. The quarter therefore occupied an unusual place in society. It was simultaneously a national symbol and an everyday tool of commerce. Its purchasing power was modest, but 25 cents could still buy useful things, operate machines, or combine with other coins to pay for groceries and services. When the 1984 P issue was struck, the mint was continuing this long tradition rather than introducing a new commemorative design. Millions of Americans would encounter these quarters without ever realizing that they were carrying a small piece of the country's numismatic history. One detail that helps identify the coin immediately is the P mint mark. For much of the history of the Philadelphia Mint, Philadelphia-produced circulating coins carried no mint mark. But that changed in 1980 when the P began appearing on regular Philadelphia coinage. By 1984, therefore, the tiny P on the Washington quarter had become an important identifier for collectors. Look closely beneath the date on the obverse, and you can see that small letter marking the coin's origin. The 1984 P Washington quarter had an enormous reported mintage of approximately 676,545,004 pieces, which means this is not a low mintage rarity in the traditional sense. That distinction is extremely important because the word rare is often misunderstood in online coin discussions. A coin can have hundreds of millions struck and still have individual examples that are genuinely scarce in elite condition. Conversely, a low mintage coin is not automatically valuable if large numbers survive in collectible condition. The 1984 P quarter demonstrates this difference beautifully. The vast majority were released into commerce, where they experienced friction, impacts, scratches, stains, and gradual wear. Coins were thrown into pockets, dropped onto counters, stacked in cash drawers, mixed together in bank bags, and repeatedly exchanged. The original production figure tells us how many were struck, but it does not tell us how many survive today with pristine surfaces. There is no reliable census of every surviving 1984 P quarter, so it would be misleading to claim an exact number of surviving coins. Millions undoubtedly remain, especially in circulated grades, while the population of truly exceptional high-grade pieces is dramatically smaller. Certification populations give us a window into the surviving elite rather than a complete count of every coin in existence. The economic circumstances surrounding the coin are also worth remembering because 1984 represented a major turning point after the difficult opening years of the decade. The Federal Reserve had fought intensely against inflation during the early 1980s, and the resulting high interest rates had contributed to a painful recession. By 1984, however, the American economy had entered a strong expansion. Factories were becoming busier, businesses were investing, and consumers were once again purchasing goods that they had postponed buying during the downturn. Reagan's administration promoted lower taxes, deregulation, and a philosophy centered on encouraging private economic activity, while critics debated the consequences of growing federal deficits and increasing national debt. Politics was intensely active as Reagan sought re-election, and the campaign year produced some of the most memorable political advertising and speeches of the era. Meanwhile, American society was being transformed by television, emerging computer technology, new forms of entertainment, and rapidly changing consumer culture. The quarter quietly participated in all of it. Imagine a 1984 P quarter leaving the mint and entering a bank shipment before being handed to a customer at a grocery store. Perhaps it was used to pay for a newspaper, placed into a vending machine, saved temporarily in a child's collection, or carried across the country in someone's pocket. It could have passed through hundreds of hands without anyone noticing the date. This constant movement was precisely what circulating coinage was designed to accomplish, and it also explains why finding a remarkably preserved example today can be so difficult. And that brings us to the real mystery surrounding the 1984 P. Washington quarter. Its importance does not come from a secret story that every example is rare. It comes from the extraordinary contrast between enormous original production and the small number of coins that can survive in truly elite condition. More than 676 million were struck, yet the finest pieces must have avoided damage at almost every stage of their journey. From the moment a blank planchet entered the press to the moment a finished quarter was transported, packaged, distributed, handled, and stored. The coin had to escape the marks that normally appear when fresh quarters collide with one another in bags and containers. It then had to avoid circulation, pocket wear, cleaning, environmental damage, and careless storage. That is an incredible chain of events for any modern circulating coin. When you look at an ordinary 1984 P quarter, you are seeing the result of mass production and decades of everyday use. When you look at a superbly preserved example, you are seeing something much less common. A survivor that somehow escaped the normal fate of its generation. So if you have one of these quarters, do not immediately assume that the P mint mark makes it rare, and do not automatically believe exaggerated claims about enormous values. Instead, examine it carefully. Check the date, confirm the P mint mark, inspect the surfaces under good lighting, look for signs of cleaning, study the strike, and search for genuine mint-made abnormalities. Most will remain ordinary 25-cent pieces, but a superior specimen can be worth far more than face value. The 1984 P. Washington quarter is ultimately a reminder that rarity is not always born at the mint. Sometimes rarity develops slowly, through decades of survival, and the coin that seemed completely ordinary in 1984 can become remarkably interesting when history, preservation, condition, and collector demand finally come together. Next up to in the when you place a 1984 Washington quarter with the P mint mark beneath a camera or magnifying glass. The first thing that becomes apparent is how much artistic information has been compressed into such a small piece of metal. This coin is only $0.25, yet its surfaces carry a portrait, inscriptions, national symbols, a denomination, a date, and a carefully balanced composition that was designed to remain recognizable through years of circulation. The design seen on the 1984 P quarter was not created specifically in 1984. Its artistic roots reach back to the creation of the Washington quarter in 1932, when the United States wanted an appropriate way to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. The Treasury Department selected sculptor John Flanagan to create the basic design that would become the familiar Washington quarter. Flanagan was not simply an engraver producing mechanical lettering on a blank disc. He was a trained sculptor who approached the portrait as a three-dimensional work of art, thinking about the shape of Washington's head, the direction of the light, the relationship between raised and recessed surfaces, and the way the portrait would translate from sculpture into a coin. That distinction matters because a coin die is essentially a miniature sculpture in reverse. Every raised detail on the finished quarter originates from carefully prepared recessed elements on the die. When you look at the 1984 P quarter today, you are therefore looking at the continuation of an artistic concept developed more than 50 years earlier. The Philadelphia Mint's production machinery reproduced Flanagan's established composition thousands upon thousands of times, but every successful strike still depended on precision. That combination of sculpture and industrial technology is one of the most fascinating characteristics of American coinage. John Flanagan's background helps explain why his Washington portrait looks the way it does. Born in New Jersey in 1865, Flanagan developed his artistic abilities during an era when American sculpture was strongly influenced by European classical traditions. He studied under Augustus St. Gaudens, one of the most celebrated American sculptors of the period, and that connection placed him within an important tradition of American medallic and monumental sculpture. St. Gaudens emphasized strong composition, realistic human forms, and expressive but controlled details, and Flanagan absorbed many of those principles. Flanagan eventually became an accomplished sculptor in his own right, producing medals, monuments, architectural sculpture, and portrait work. When the Washington Quarter project emerged, the choice of artist was particularly important because officials wanted Washington represented with dignity and historical authority. Flanagan's approach avoided turning Washington into a theatrical hero. Instead, the portrait presents him as composed, mature, and thoughtful. The design was based in part on the famous bust of Washington by Jean-Antoine Houdon, the French sculptor who had studied Washington from life in the 18th century. Houdon's work became one of the most important visual references for later representations of Washington because he had the unusual opportunity to observe the first president directly. Flanagan drew upon this established likeness while translating the three-dimensional character of Washington's head into a form suitable for coinage. The result was a portrait that could be recognized immediately while still possessing the restrained character expected from a national circulating coin. By 1984, Flanagan himself had been gone for decades, but his artistic fingerprint remained on every Washington quarter produced according to that design. Now look closely at the obverse of the 1984 P quarter, because nearly every visible element has a purpose. At the center is Washington's left-facing portrait, with the head and shoulders occupying most of the available space. His expression is serious but not aggressive. The forehead is broad, the nose is prominent, the lips are restrained, and the jaw forms a strong lower boundary to the portrait. His hair is tied behind his head in the 18th century style associated with portraits of Washington, and the sculpted strands create a network of lines that can become especially fascinating under magnification. Above the portrait, following the curve of the rim, is the word Liberty. To the left of Washington's neck is the national motto, "In God We Trust," and beneath the bust is the date 1984. Immediately beside the date is the small P mint mark identifying Philadelphia production. That little letter is easy to overlook, but for collectors it provides an essential piece of information about the coin's origin. Notice also how the lettering is positioned within the available space. Nothing is allowed to overwhelm the central portrait. The rim creates a visual boundary around everything, protecting the composition while giving the coin a finished appearance. On a sharply struck example, the letters should have clean edges and the portrait should show strong definition. Under magnification, collectors can examine Washington's hair, cheek, jawline, and other high points for evidence of wear or strike weakness. The field surrounding the portrait should also be inspected because these open areas reveal contact marks extremely easily. A coin can have a beautiful portrait and still receive a lower grade if its fields are covered with distracting abrasions. The value range of the 1984 P quarter illustrates this enormous difference between an ordinary survivor and an elite specimen. In circulated condition, a normal example will generally remain around face value because the mint produced hundreds of millions and many survived decades of use. Even lightly circulated coins are usually inexpensive unless they possess an important error or variety. In uncirculated grades, however, the picture changes gradually rather than instantly. Lower mint state examples may sell for only a small premium, while coins reaching MS-64 and MS-65 can bring several dollars or more depending on quality and market demand. Premium MS-66 pieces can move into the tens or even higher, while superb MS-67 examples become much more difficult to locate and can command hundreds or potentially more depending on the exact coin, certification, and marketplace. At the extreme upper end, a truly extraordinary certified example can enter the thousands of dollars category. But collectors should never confuse a price guide with a guaranteed selling price. Auction results, population rarity, appeal, certification service, market timing, and competition between buyers all influence what an individual coin actually brings. The highest grade population is particularly important because one grade point can represent a dramatic reduction in the number of surviving coins. A quarter that looks nearly perfect to the naked eye may reveal microscopic contact marks under magnification that prevent it from reaching the next grade. This is why professional grading has such importance for elite modern coins. And when you finish examining the 1984 P. Washington quarter, the most remarkable thing may be realizing that its greatest artistic achievement is not simply the portrait of George Washington or the eagle on the reverse, but the way those elements have survived as a recognizable national design for generations. John Flanagan transformed historical imagery into a compact sculptural composition that could be reproduced millions of times without losing its identity. The influence of classical sculpture, the connection to Houdon's Washington portrait, the disciplined arrangement of lettering, and the symbolic language of the eagle, arrows, and olive branches all come together on a surface smaller than the palm of your hand. The 1984 P issue carried that artistic legacy into a decade of economic recovery, technological expansion, and cultural change, even though most Americans who used the coins never stopped to study them. Today, collectors have the opportunity to look more carefully. Under magnification, you can trace the contours of Washington's face, inspect the texture of his hair, examine the tiny P beside the date, study the open fields for contact marks, and then turn the coin over to explore the eagle's feathers, arrows, olive branches, inscriptions, and denomination. Most 1984 P quarters will never become major rarities, and that fact makes the truly exceptional survivors even more interesting. The coin's story is not one of millions of hidden fortunes waiting in every pocket. It is the story of how a mass-produced object can become scarce in extraordinary preservation, how a familiar design can acquire new meaning with age, and how the difference between an ordinary quarter and a remarkable collectible can sometimes be found in details so small that you need a magnifying glass to see.